Hi, this is Celeste, and this is 10 Minutes of History. So we recently lost our beloved replica of the boat Pilgrim at the Ocean Institute in Dana Point Harbor. So I decided to go back and reread 2 Years Before the Mast, which was written by Richard Henry Dana as a student at Harvard. So he started his work at Harvard in 1831, pre-law, and in his third year he contracted the measles. So it weakened his eyes so much that it hurt him to read. So he decided to take a break, and he decided that break would be to jump on a brig from Boston Harbor around the Horn up to California. And actually it did help his eyes because he was educated and he was literate. He kept a diary every day that he was on that ship. And in 1841, he published his journal of that trip, which ended up being this book, 2 Years Before the Mast. The reason it's called 2 Years Before the Mast is because he was so green when he got on that ship, he didn't even deserve a bunk with the other sailors in the forecastle. He ended up sleeping in steerage. And in the steerage compartment, which was under the bow of the boat, is where they keep all the sails and all the rigging and the lines and a whole bunch of junk rope, which I'll get to later. So on his journey, one of the very first things that he learns when he gets on the boat is the different parts of the boat. And I find it interesting when you read this that they have the starboard side of the boat and the larboard side of the boat, which is not a word that we usually use today. So I thought it was interesting to tell you why and how those two words came about. So before you had a rudder on a boat, you stirred it with a paddle. And since most people were right-handed, say you were in a canoe, you would set that paddle off the right side of the boat. So when you did that, then it was on the starboard side of the boat. Board was B-O-D, which meant boat, and the star was for steering. So you were on the steerboard side of the boat. Now, as you're going along on your boat and as you come into the dock, you always want to come into the dock on this side, because if you came on this side, you'd break your paddle or hurt your hand. So you always came in on that side. And that was also the side that you loaded the boat from. And so lar, which means load, is the side that you loaded from. So you had your star or steerboard side of the boat and your lar or load board side of the boat. And that's where we got those two terms. Now, in 1844, the Royal British Navy decided that was way too confusing. When the captain is barking out his orders in the middle of the night, and if there's a storm, the sailors couldn't tell if he was saying larboard or starboard. So that's when they decided to change larboard to port, because it meant the port side anyway, because port also means a load, because you had portage, a porter that loaded it onto the boat. So now we have port and starboard. You have watches on a boat, and he was on the starboard watch. So you had a captain, and then you had a chief mate who was in charge of one of the watches, and the second mate that was in charge of the second watch. So there was a competition between the different sides of the boat, and he was always proud because his side of the boat was run by the chief, the second mate, I'm sorry. The chief mate never went aloft. He never went up into the sails, because a good part of the work that had to be done would be the reefing and the furling of the sails. And so because they had that extra man on his watch, because the second mate was basically a sailor, he was lower down the pole, he would go aloft and do the major part of the work. And so there would always be a competition. So when they were done with their side, they would all slide down those poles and ropes and get down to the bottom first and just make it very much apparent that they had won the race of whatever the task was that they were doing. While you're on these watches, so you're on a watch 4 hours on and 4 hours off, and you're working the entire time that you are on your watch when you're on deck. When you're below deck, you can do mostly sleep, especially if the weather is bad, or you can do your personal things, but it's dark down there, so there's not a whole lot you can do. So mostly they slept on those watches. Now, one time of day, the watch that was between 4 o'clock and 8 o'clock, we called the dog watches. And they're the dog watches. They're only 2 hours long. If you don't have a dog watch, then every day would repeat with the same times. And so everybody would always have to repeat the like midnight to 4 watch. In order to throw a wrench in there and jog those watches, they put in these 2-hour watches. So it would alternate the watches through the day. The dog watches were also during dinner time, so that you made sure that everybody had some time off during that 4 to 8 so that they could have dinner. Also, they say they called them the dog watches because it was dark and pretty much only dogs were up on land at that time of day. So I don't know if that's true or not, but it sounds good. During your time that you were on, even if there wasn't anything to do, maybe there was no wind, so there wasn't a lot to do, you were still expected to work. You were scrubbing, you were cleaning the lines or the anchor lines, or de-rusting things. One of the things that always happened is before a captain left port, he would buy a substantial amount of junk rope. And that was just pieces of rope that, mostly anchor lines, because those didn't last as long, and they were very thick, and they were coated in pine tar and sap. And what he did with all of this is that he made sure that these people would be working the entire time. So you would take these big pieces of this line, and first they had to pound it to get the tar loosened on it. And then they would pick it, and that's called picking oakum. And so if you weren't washing, scrubbing, furling, reefing, you were picking oakum. It's very hard on your hands because you can see like there's some pieces back here, and I'll get to this in a second too. This is the kind of line, so that would be like little pieces of oakum coming off of it. Prisoners did this in the 19th century. Prisoners did it. Children did it before we had child labor laws. So what they did was, after you got all of this oakum together, you could use it to fill in the planks of the boat, or you could also use it to spin into longer yarns. You could do hand spinning of these little pieces, fragments, or pretty much every ship during that time, according to Dana, had a spinning wheel on board. And so you would spin this oakum into yarns. Now, as you're spinning oakum into yarns, you're telling stories. And a yarn is basically a story that doesn't make a lot of sense, that has an element to it that is unbelievable. So that's what they would do, is to entertain themselves. They would sit around and tell these yarns while they were spinning this oakum out. Another word on the boat that I just absolutely love is also part of the watch duties in the morning. So part of the morning watch was that you had to fill the scuttlebutt. Now there was only a certain amount of fresh water on the boat, and it was held down in the holds. But every day, the morning watch was responsible to fill the scuttlebutt with fresh water, and that was the water to be drank that day. Now, a scuttlebutt, a butt is basically another word for a cask. And to scuttle something means you've drilled holes in it. Like if you're going to sink a boat, you would drill holes in it to scuttle it and make it sink. So they either drilled or pounded holes into this scuttlebutt, and then of course corked them up. So during the day, when you were coming up to get a drink of fresh water, you all went to the scuttlebutt, and with your hands or a cup or whatever you had means you would drink from the scuttlebutt. And of course, as you stood around the scuttlebutt, you would gossip. And so today, we call scuttlebutt gossip, because that's what you do when you stand around the water cooler, right? So I just love that. I love that where that word came from and how it's come along. The last word I'm going to tell you, we had up on our museum on top of our sailing exhibit, and it was talking about all the different boats that we have here in the harbor, and the heading was footloose and fancy free. So footloose is a word that definitely comes from sailing, because of the 3 parts of the sail, one part is the foot. And if that foot is loose, it's flapping in the wind, and that means that it's not adhered to anything. And so the phrase to be footloose means you're free. You can go out and do whatever you want. Fancy free is a word that just means you don't have a wife or or a fiance or a girlfriend. So you're fancy free, meaning you're free. And so footloose and fancy free basically mean the same thing. It means you're free, you're not adhered, you're not stuck down to anything. So that's about it. That's 10 minutes of history. I hope you enjoy. Bye.